Jaslyn's candle was the last light in the room. The story she would tell wouldn't be the most terrifying one of the evening, but it would unlock the secret to why this game was only for the strong and was never really meant to be played at all. It was for those without fear, or those who could at least contain their fear long enough to get through the ceremony. Clutching her candle tight with both hands, Jaslyn could feel the burning of the hot wax finding its way down to her fingers. But that's part of the game, isn't it? Controlling the fear and the pain is the most important part of making this work. And Jaslyn wasn't about to be the one to break the cycle, for if she were to lose concentration, she and her 4 friends would have to start all over. And it had already been 2 hours since the ritual started. Ritual, yeah, that's what we'll call it. A game has a clear winner and a definitive loser. In this ritual, there are only those who don't lose their minds. Trembling from what had already occurred as her 4 other friends told their stories, then blew out their candles, she debated saying the hell with it and not finishing. She was afraid. There was more fear in her 5-foot 1-inch frame than she thought could come from all 5 of them put together. But there was no way she would disappoint her new friends, so she continued her story. Grasping her candle with sweaty, trembling hands, she had to adjust her grip as the candle would slide down inside her wet palms. She told a story of an old man on her street that had passed away. Whenever anyone would try to move into his house after he was gone, they would move out within months. There was no positive proof that ghosts or demons were involved, but the whole neighborhood speculated that the old man never really left, even after death. At night, neighbors swore they heard voices coming from within the empty house, and they could see shadows moving through the windows. One time, the chimney even had smoke belching from it. Jaslyn continued for another 30 minutes about the old house, a normal ghost story of a normal haunted house that every neighborhood seemed to have. As unimpressive as the story was, it was all she could come up with. When she finished, she gulped some air into her lungs, looked around for her friends in the dimly lit tunnel with wide, fearful eyes. She could feel their eyes upon her. Then, she blew out the candle with a gentle breeze from her lungs, hoping the candle wouldn't go out. But it did just that. Then, darkness. Complete darkness. She could hear the voices of her friends making hushed whispers among themselves, some laughing. They sounded different. She had only heard the stories of this ritual recently, but a lifetime of knowledge wouldn't have prepared her for the horror Jaslyn would come to know. Maybe this was all just a big prank set on to initiate her into this new group. She reached out for Thomas to her right but couldn't grab onto him. She reached to her left for Edith, but the same result. She fumbled for her lighter, but it fell to the floor and skidded away to blackness on the floor. She tried her cell phone, but the battery was dead. How cliche, she thought out loud. She could hear the group mocking her. She began to cry, then calmed down to a soft sob as she felt a hand on her shoulder. Jaslyn, why are you crying? It sounded like Thomas. Maybe. Let's get you out of here, he said, his voice echoing within the halls of the death tunnel of the Waverly Hills Sanatorium. If you're enjoying this video, or any of the others that I've written and narrated, hit the subscribe button, like the video, and leave a comment. Alright, now, back to the story. 4 days earlier, Jaslyn had been wanting to tour the Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Louisville, Kentucky for as long as she could say the words properly. There was something about the paranormal and visiting one of the most haunted places in the United States that really captivated her imagination. She had a fascination with the paranormal that was borderline unhealthy, but as much as she wanted to go, she couldn't find anyone to go with her. It held her back from exploring her darker side. Darker side. She was so mild and timid that it made everyone question her motives for even wanting to do this. I think it's better to say that she had a fascination with the paranormal, but also a very real fear of it. Jaslyn wasn't the type to run head on into a haunted house. She would usually shy away from them. In fact, she used the excuse that no one would go with her just to keep her from actually going to Waverly Hills. But still, there was an unmistakable pull to it. She was afraid, but the idea beckoned her to at least try it. So, on the verge of her 18th birthday, Jaslyn decided she was going to actually do it. Tired of hearing the taunts from others that she would never actually go through with it. This would be her first gift to herself as an adult. Jaslyn decided a 2-hour tour of the vacant sanatorium would be good enough to satiate her curiosity. There was an overnight tour available, but she knew she didn't have the courage to make it that long. But Jaslyn would have to do this alone. It wasn't that big of a deal. She had watched videos on it and knew there were usually big groups that went on these tours. She wouldn't be completely alone, but it wasn't unusual. She often did things alone. Not this scary, though. It was exciting. Scary, but exciting. She was going to prove to herself and everyone else she wasn't too afraid. And maybe, just maybe, this would give her the confidence to pursue the paranormal further, perhaps with an actual ghost hunting group. But for now, she would have to get through the first step. Jaslyn booked the tour for the day after her 18th birthday. She wanted to do it on her birthday, but her parents insisted on spending that day with her. The whole time, they warned her jokingly not to bring any ghosts or spirits home with her. Her father said, "You know, the Millers next door brought a ghost home with them. Now they hear singing in the middle of the night. I swear, it's true." As he smiled, Jaslyn knew it wasn't true, but she played along. Her parents were actually supportive of her decision, even though she would be driving south an hour and a half alone. Her father looked into her deep blue eyes and knew this was something she really had to do when she told him her plan. The next morning, Jaslyn woke up with more excitement than she knew what to do with. The thought of actually going through with this made her heart race. Fear? It hadn't really hit her yet. Her mind was too preoccupied with proving she could do this to herself and everyone who doubted her. So she got herself ready, and her parents wished her luck. She hugged them, and then told them thank you for being so supportive, got in her car, and drove away. When Jaslyn arrived at Waverly Hills Sanatorium, she was 2 hours early, as she expected she would be. Looking at the sheer size and age of the former tuberculosis center intimidated her. The aged red brick on a concrete foundation was scary to see. The upper 3 floors had no glass in the windows, but the lower level looked as if there had been some recent renovations, at least from the outside. The long 5-story building was curved in the front to encapsulate the main parking lot, where many cars had come to rest for their owners to get a hint of a frightening experience. Some for the first time, and she was sure others had been there before, from the way they seemed to know exactly where they were traversing. Jaslyn got out of her car and just stared up at the building, not moving for several minutes, almost like being in a trance. At first, she didn't really think about what she was looking at until she heard others passing by, snapping her out of her catatonic state. The thoughts started pouring into her mind. Is this what she really wanted to do? She became terrified. She could feel her hands starting to shake. As much as she wanted to believe she had a darker side that would enjoy this experience, she couldn't help hearing her softer inner voice telling her that she was making a huge mistake. But it was time to push that weak voice deep into the pits of her stomach. She knew she would never forgive herself for chickening out. As she began walking, following other new arrivals haphazardly, she was only half paying attention to what she was doing and bumped into a man. He looked to be in his mid-20s, well-dressed, kind of out of place for the occasion. I mean, Jaslyn barely did her makeup before leaving her house in such a rush, and here was this guy, wearing a button-down shirt, buttoned all the way up, suspenders, and a bow tie. She thought maybe he had some formal dinner or something to attend afterwards, or an award ceremony. But when she saw his three friends who accompanied him, she figured maybe he was just one of those people, an attention seeker. The man steadied himself and looked Jaslyn over with curious eyes. First time? Jaslyn was hesitant to answer. She wasn't good at meeting new people or interacting with many humans in general. But not many people started a conversation with her either. Yeah, the man smiled. I can always tell when it's someone's first time here. Jaslyn gave a half smile in return. I guess it's pretty obvious with me. The man stepped a little closer. Are you alone? I mean, this can be a pretty scary place for a first-timer, especially if you're alone. Jaslyn, again reluctant to give too much away. She didn't know these people, but finally she answered. Yeah, just something I have to do for myself. The man extended his open hand. Thomas! Jaslyn looked at his hand, then met his palm with her own. His handshake was light, almost tender. Jaslyn. He smiled at her again. I like that. Like jazz. Okay, you're hanging out with us today. We'll show you around and keep you safe. Jaslyn knew he was joking about the safe part. There had never been any stories of anyone getting hurt nor killed at Waverly Hills. Well, not after it shut down as a sanatorium, at least. Thomas then introduced the rest of the group accompanying him, all various ages, ranging from their mid-20s up to the middle-aged. They didn't really seem like the sort of people one would generally see hanging out together. But if this was a way for her to get through this victorious, then she wouldn't ask too many questions. Edith, the oldest looking of the group, was also one with the warmest aura. You know, when you can actually see someone's inner glow. Her jet black hair was beginning to gray, and she had crow's feet and smile lines highlighting her age. Susie, the youngest looking, had blonde hair and an innocent face, but she was the quietest, just giving a simple hi as she welcomed Jaslyn to the group. Then there was Robert. Jaslyn didn't know what to think of this tall, thin man. When introduced, he just inclined his head slightly to acknowledge Jaslyn's presence, then looked away as if she ceased to exist. Maybe it was the middle child syndrome he was displaying, as he was about the center of the ages of the other three. But Thomas seemed like the spokesman for the whole group, the most outgoing, and he seemed very kind. Jaslyn walked between Thomas and Edith as they headed toward the line that had formed at the entrance. So, what's with the fancy clothes? She felt as though she was being rude as soon as the words escaped her lips, and punished herself for even bringing it up. Thomas didn't seem offended at all. Don't worry, I get that a lot. This is just how I've always dressed. Something of a habit. Jaslyn could hear Robert and Susie chuckling behind her, as if to say that this is a long-running joke. Jaslyn tucked away her shame, and she just continued to listen to the friends talk among themselves. Nothing big, just idle chit-chat, making jokes, laughing, except Robert. That guy never seemed to even smile. But there was something calming about him that didn't get Jaslyn too riled up. Thomas put his hand on Jaslyn's back. We already have our tickets. Go ahead and get yours and meet us back here. Jaslyn stepped forward in the line. She was sure she ran into them as soon as they arrived on site and didn't remember seeing them get tickets, per se. It was odd that they mentioned tickets anyway. She purchased hers online and had it ready in her email. I don't need to buy a ticket. I booked it online. She thought that maybe they had done the same thing. Thomas smiled and placed his hand on the small of her back. I should have known. You'd come prepared. As he gently moved her in the direction they needed to go, another line. Coincidentally, they all had booked the same time for their tours. This was convenient for Jaslyn. They seemed nice enough, and this was her first time doing something like this. As they all stood in line, Robert finally spoke, the first time he had done so since Jaslyn joined their little group. Are you going to ask her, Thomas? His deep voice seemed to echo slightly, even outdoors. Thomas motioned for Robert to calm down. Robert rolled his eyes. He knew if he didn't remind Thomas, they would go the entire tour disappointed. Again. Like they had so many other times. Susie was next to chime in. No, Thomas, you need to ask her. We can't do this again. You can't just expect her to go along with it at the last minute. Jaslyn stopped trying to ignore them and turned to Thomas. Ask me what? Thomas rubbed the back of his neck and tilted his head slightly. Jaslyn asked again, a little sterner. Ask me what, Thomas? He took a few seconds to form the words, and Robert nudged him. It's just that we've been trying to play this game here the last few times we've been doing these tours, but it takes 5 people, and, as you can see, there are only 4 of us. Jaslyn felt a rush of adrenaline as her feelings shifted from excitement to one of being used. No, it isn't anything bad, just something fun we heard about and wanted to try. When we go on these tours, nothing really happens, and we want to try to spook ourselves. Jaslyn relaxed a little bit. What do you mean nothing happens? Thomas explained that even though Waverly Hills is creepy, these tours often have too many living people in them, and they are rushed through too fast to actually see or feel anything paranormal. She then asked, Okay, what kind of game are we talking about? Half expecting it to be hide and seek or ghost in the graveyard or something. The game. Thomas went into great detail about a game that they had heard other tourists talking about some years prior. One that would scare the ever-living pants off all the participants. The goal is to see who gets frightened out of their game first, and who is the last standing. The game consisted of 5 players, one at the north corner of the square, one at the south, one at east, and one at west. The 5th person sits in the center. All have candles lit in an otherwise dark room, holding the candle with both hands in front of them, then moving in a crisscross motion starting with the north, then south, then east, then west, and ending in the center. They would tell a scary story of at least 30 minutes in length each. When they were finished with their own story, they were to blow out their candle, making the room increasingly darker. It had to be done in that order, though. If anyone messed up, they would have to start all over. Thomas was hesitant, but told Jaslyn that it wasn't just the stories that would scare the players, that something was supposed to happen after each candle was blown out. Shadows, noises. He assured her that nothing really happened. It was just the dimming light that would play tricks on them. He was very good at downplaying his stance on the paranormal. This whole thing sounded troubling to Jaslyn. The tour was only 2 hours long, and it was guided. There would be no way to squeeze something like this into such a tight time frame under the watchful eyes of the tour guides. But Thomas made a convincing argument that they had done this before, and not just one time, or at least tried. They had a way of slipping away from the guides when they were in a specific part of the abandoned hospital. However, Jaslyn was no fool. This whole thing seemed like a setup, as if they had chosen her specifically due to looking naive or afraid. Then she wondered, why would they choose someone who was already afraid before stepping foot inside the building? Thomas interrupted her thoughts. We understand if you don't want to do this. It's just a silly game that we've been wanting to try out. Jaslyn considered it for a minute, albeit lightly. What better way to prove that she can do this than by going all in? I mean, a guided tour of a supposed haunted hospital is one thing, but to sneak away and play around with the paranormal on her own? Yeah, that would elevate her to the next level entirely. Okay, but I'm fresh out of candles, Edith replied. We have you covered. It was a little unsettling what the 5 new friends were planning, but the risk was definitely worth the reward for Jaslyn. But it didn't stop her uneasy feeling about the whole situation. However, there was no way she wanted to upset her new friends, or at least her tour friends. Besides, it sounded like fun to be the devious one for once. Look at me, she thought. Jaslyn, the troublemaker. Then she kind of chuckled to herself. Edith glanced at Jaslyn. What's so funny, dear? Oh, nothing. I'm just not usually the daring one to take risks like this. It's fun, though. Edith smiled ear to ear. Well, this is going to be fun for all of us. Finally, it was Jaslyn's group's turn to go in. The tour guide stepped up to them and introduced himself and his partner. One would be at the head of the group talking about the history of the sanatorium and the ghosts of Waverly Hills. The other would be bringing up the rear to make sure no one got separated, lost, or had any funny ideas about sneaking off. This made Jaslyn nervous. Thomas gave her a side eye. It's going to be fine, trust me, as if he could read her thoughts. That didn't make her feel any better about what they were planning. They also didn't tell her when they would try to slip away. This was starting to feel weird. However, Jaslyn wasn't the type to back out once she committed to something, no matter how weird it felt. She learned to push those negative thoughts aside and just go with it. She figured she would have time to regret it or revel in it once it was over. Hopefully it would be the latter and she was just overreacting. She had never been in this type of situation before. Well, not this exact situation. As they entered the building, Jaslyn noticed how dark it seemed, despite it being the middle of the day. Light poured in through the windows, but only left streaks of dull white light on the dilapidated floor throughout the first floor rooms. The halls and corridors were even worse. No light penetrated these hallowed walls, and it had been 60 years since this hospital was closed down, but there were still hints of its purpose all of those decades before. The rooms had old beds and larger pieces of out-of-date, rusty hospital equipment. The tour guide talked about the history of the hospital, opened in 1910 as a tuberculosis center, how it went through different renovations and expansions over the 5 decades it was in use. But the history of the former treatment center was not as substantial as the history of the paranormal activity that had been going on there since its closing. One dark room after another, one dark hall after the next. The eerie feeling filled the atmosphere of the hospital, once meant to give hope to the sick and dying. But now it still housed those who came there for relief from their very human, very real illness. But the feelings were there, and that's all, at least on the surface. The tour group was filled with about 25 living humans. The concentration of living energy seemed to dull the experience Jaslyn was hoping to have. How could this be bravery? Other than a couple creepy rooms, some creepier stories, and maybe a shadow moving on the other end of the hallway, which she downplayed as a simple trick of the limited light. This was not going to be the paranormal highlight that was to usher Jaslyn's triumphant return home. Interestingly enough, though, there was a bit of fear as they would work their way up another set of dark stairs, or into a room that seemed like more had happened there than what the guide was letting on, which was weird in itself, because this guy seemed to be playing up the dark paranormal activities that had occurred here more than what any of them were experiencing. Not seeing anything wasn't so bad, because Jaslyn could feel the darkness, the sadness, and the pain throughout the facility. After the first hour of the tour, Jaslyn could feel herself getting into it, concentrating more on the energy of the place rather than what she was seeing. Thomas, Edith, Susie, and Robert stayed close to Jaslyn, but they didn't say much. There was still no mention of the plan to escape the clutches of the dreaded tour guides. This was okay with her. She was having enough fun without worrying if she was going to be abducted or murdered by some cult. But Jaslyn had almost forgotten about that by this point. They just followed along, waiting for the right time and place, she figured, staying quiet the entire time. As they entered the third floor hallway from the stairs, there was a different feeling. This time, it wasn't a residual sadness, more like something was actually living there. No, not living, unknowingly dead, unaware of the fate that had befallen it. Jaslyn seemed to be the only one who noticed it, getting a chill up her spine, making the hairs on the back of her neck and her arms stand at attention. But it was just another feeling, or so she first thought. Standing in the front of the group with Thomas and the others close, she listened as the guide told a story of a boy called Timmy, the spirit of a young boy that wanders these floors. Just then, Jaslyn felt something tap against the toe of her shoe. The dim light of the guide's flashlight barely illuminated the ground in front of her. She looked down and saw a dirty old yellow ball, barely moving from the impact with Jaslyn's shoe. The guide followed her gaze. "Ah, look everyone, it looks like Timmy wants to play." The crowd gasped as they all swarmed around Jaslyn. She wasn't amused. What were the chances a ball would strike her foot just as the man was telling the story of this kid's ghost? It was a fun thought. It made her afraid for just a moment, but it soon dissipated. The last leg of the tour had Jaslyn feeling a little less than disappointed, but she felt a sense of accomplishment. She faced it and came out on top all the same. This could open the door for other things. She'd been in one of the most haunted places of the United States and was about to emerge a winner. But they had one more place to visit. The last stop, the body chute. A 500-foot tunnel beneath the complex, used to transport thousands of bodies away from the hospital, away from the saddened eyes of the living inhabitants. Another way for the staff to keep the patients calm and hopeful. Now it had been an old run-down access tunnel with no lighting. The small light the tour guide held lit up portions of the wall that showcased the trademark of vandals, graffiti. But it seemed no amount of light would penetrate the blackness that led the chute away from the building. Standing at the opening of the tunnel, a sound came from behind the group. The guides flashed their lights in the direction of the disturbing noise, and Thomas grabbed Jaslyn, forced her into the black tunnel. Edith, Robert, and Susie filed in behind them, quickly making their escape from the living and into the unknown pitch black. Jaslyn almost let out a scream, but suddenly remembered the plan to slip away. She had hoped they had forgotten, but here they were, alone in the blackness. The five of them watched as the lights of the tour guides headed away from the tunnel, ending their stint of duty for the would-be thrill-seekers. Jaslyn watched in wonder as they slipped away, amused at how none of them noticed the smaller group slipping into the shadows. But this was scary. She was now alone in the death tunnel with 4 people she had only just met. They could be anything, psychopaths, murderers, anything. She began dwelling on those thoughts. She began to speak when she felt a hand cover her mouth. The sound echoed through the farther reaches of the tunnel as Thomas let out the silencing tone. She couldn't see him, but Jaslyn heard Robert. "Okay, they're gone." A single cigarette lighter and a candle was pressed into Jaslyn's hand. She gripped it between her sweaty fingers and clammy palm, heart beating so fast that she was afraid they would hear it. "What are you going to do to me?" Jaslyn cried out in a low voice. Edith answered. "To you? Nothing. We told you we were going to play a silly game. That's all. Light the candle, then light our candles." Jaslyn fumbled to strike the lighter, but when it finally lit, it looked like the light of 1,000 suns against the dark contrast of the tunnel. She could see the other 4 holding their candles in front of them. "You got to meet Timmy," Robert said with a hint of jealousy. Jaslyn lit her candle, then used her candle to light the other candles, but didn't pay much attention to Robert. She had bigger things to worry about, being alone with 4 strangers in a dark tunnel, and no one knows she's even missing. Thomas approached Jaslyn with kind eyes. This dim candlelight made all of them look a little different. Shadows filled the indentations of their faces and made them all look almost demonic. "We aren't going to hurt you. We're just going to tell stories to see if anything happens, to see how real this game is. Now, Have a seat in the middle of the floor." As naive as Jaslyn is, she still didn't trust many people, and this situation was no different. "I want to go home. Please let me go." Susie put her hand on Jaslyn's shoulder, a little kinder than she had been all day. "No one is stopping you from leaving. You can walk out now and just tell them you were left behind when you bent down to tie your shoe or something. Just don't tell them we're here." The group parted to allow Jaslyn to leave. This comforted her. She took a few steps and stopped with her back to them. "A few stories and we leave?" Thomas nodded his head. "I promise we'll leave after just a few stories." Jaslyn slowly turned around and sat in the middle of the tunnel floor. It was against her better judgment, but she was there to be afraid and come out with a new understanding of her fascination with the paranormal. But this was anything but a silly game. The rest of the group got excited and sat on the floor around her. Directly in front of her sat Robert. "I'm north." Behind her directly sat Susie. "I'm south. I get to go second." To her right, Thomas took his seat. "I'll be the east." Finally, to her left, sat Edith. "I'm the west." All five with candles held in both hands in front of them. Jaslyn looked, and the light wasn't enough to ignite either end of the tunnel. It was dark. Robert began. He told a story of a nurse that resided on the 4th floor of Waverly Hills, a story that was briefly touched on by the tour guide. However, Robert went into much more frightening detail, how the staff was never allowed to leave the hospital due to how contagious tuberculosis was, often leaving their families to try to comfort those who would never see their families again. He went on about how the healthy staff would strike up relationships with each other. The same happened with the nurse when she and a doctor started having an affair. Room 502. That's where the nurse lived, until she didn't live anymore. She hung herself in the very room. Robert ended his story after 30 minutes, scooted backward, and blew out his candle. As if to hide in a shadow, Jaslyn couldn't see him anymore. But she heard a gasp and felt a slight breeze of cold air and chill brush past her. Her candle and those of the other players flickered, but none blew out. Susie went next. She told the story of a dark entity that resides within the walls of Waverly Hills. It remains on the 4th floor and crawls around on all fours, clinging to the ceiling, walls, and floor. It moves effortlessly throughout the entire floor. She too went on for 30 minutes. Then, when she was finished, she scooted backwards and blew out her candle. Again, another rush of cold air. But this time something appeared and passed through Jaslyn, a mist, heading down the tunnel once Susie's light was extinguished. After that settled, Thomas looked at Jaslyn and saw tears start to stream down her face. She was terrified, and he could tell. He placed his finger to his lips and shook his head. She understood the rules of the game. Don't interrupt the process, or they would have to start all over. Thomas held his candle firm between his hands. He began his story, continuing that of Susie, about the demon who glides through the halls of the 4th floor, snatching souls that he comes across. Then, of the few living he had possessed throughout the generations, only to return to the halls of the 4th floor. After 30 minutes, he scooted back out of the light of the remaining 2 players and blew out his candle. Another rush of cold air collided with Jaslyn as it stopped in the very spot Thomas once sat. This time, there was a form, not human. Terrifying, with no eyes. It didn't even seem to notice Jaslyn as it brushed up against her to rush back down the tunnel. Edith was the last to go before Jaslyn. Jaslyn felt like they were the only 2 there, but she could still hear the others breathing around her. That didn't stop her from sobbing silently. She didn't want to be here anymore, and she definitely did not want to start this game over again. She really wanted to get up and leave, but was too afraid to move. Edith went on with the scariest story yet. It was about the tunnel. the very tunnel they were sitting in, how there was a way for the spirits of the dead to pass on through this tunnel, but they needed someone of the living to help them. Once the ritual started, it couldn't be stopped. It had to follow through, or the spirits would be returned with no hope of ever passing on. Trapped on the fourth floor forever to be chased and hunted by the demon. Jaslyn listened on as she thought maybe that's what this game was, but it couldn't be. She dismissed it quickly, holding her candle tight. It's just a scary game meant to get me to run away and lose the game, she thought to herself. But she was steadfast and wasn't about to chicken out. Edith finished her story in the allotted 30 minutes, scooted backward, and blew out her candle. Again, the same rush of cold air. Only this time a full form rushed up the tunnel with it, floating, white and stringy, bits of torn transparent robes trailing behind it, face first and stopping at the spot Edith once sat, then rushing back down the tunnel. Jaslyn felt alone, but she could still hear the breathing of the others. She knew it was her turn to tell a story. The story she would tell wouldn't be the most terrifying one of the evening, but it would unlock the secret to why this game was only for the strong and was never meant to be played at all by the living. It was for those without fear, or those who could at least contain their fear long enough to get through the ceremony. Clutching her candle tight with both hands, Jaslyn could feel the burning of the hot wax finding its way down to her fingers. But that's part of the game, isn't it? Controlling the fear and the pain is the most important part of making this work. And Jaslyn wasn't about to be the one to break the cycle, for if she were to lose concentration, she and her 4 new friends would have to start all over. And it had already been 2 hours since the ritual started. Ritual. Yeah, that's what we'll call it. A game has a clear winner and a definitive loser. In this ritual, there are only those who don't lose their minds. Jaslyn went on with her story about the old man who once lived on her street. He passed away and never vacated the home. Jaslyn continued for another 30 minutes about the old house. A normal ghost story of a normal haunted house that every neighborhood seemed to have. As unimpressive as that story was, it was all she could come up with. When she was finished, she gulped some air into her lungs, looked around for her friends in the dimly lit room with wide, fearful eyes. She could feel their eyes upon her. Then she blew out the candle with the gentle breeze from her lungs, hoping the candle wouldn't go out. But it did just that. Then, darkness. Complete darkness. She could hear the voices of her friends making hushed whispers among themselves, some laughing. They sounded different. Maybe this was all just a big prank set on to initiate her into this new group. She reached out for Thomas to her right but couldn't grab onto him. She reached to her left for Edith, but the same result. She fumbled for her lighter, but it fell to the floor and skidded away to some unseen part of the darkness. She tried her cell phone, but the battery was dead. How cliché, she thought out loud. She could hear the group mocking her. She began to cry, and calmed down to a soft sob as she felt a hand on her shoulder. Jaslyn, why are you crying? It sounded like Thomas. Maybe, but different. Let's get you out of here, he said, his voice echoing within the halls of the body chute. Jaslyn stood, and the hand released her, leaving her in total darkness. The laughter continued, getting louder and louder, echoing, taunting her. She reached her arms out to feel the wall, trying to gain some kind of bearing. Finally, the tips of her fingers touched the wall as she started her way slowly upward. She could feel hands tapping her as the air passed by her, touching her back, her legs, her arms. Some would grasp her tight, then let go again. The voice appeared behind her. You're getting closer, Jaslyn. But it felt like she was no closer to the entrance than she had been when she started walking along the wall, tripping over rocks, chunks of concrete, and debris just strewn about from vagrants and vandals. Hurrying back to her feet, feeling the scrapes and cuts, sobbing uncontrollably, keeping her hand along the wall, another pair of hands grabbed her and spun her, sending her into the center of the tunnel. Jaslyn reached out again until she touched the wall with the same hand and continued to try to follow it upward. One voice was breathing on the side of her neck, as if it were keeping pace with her. Blind in the dark, Jaslyn tried to shoo it away with her free hand. It laughed and continued its pursuit. Finally, up ahead, light. Not a bright light. Not the bright light Jaslyn was afraid of finding that everybody talks about at the end of a tunnel, but a flickering light. It was moving side to side at the end of the tunnel. The closer she got, the more the voices trailed off behind her. And the closer she got, the more Jaslyn could make out the shapes of people. Real people. Living people. One even had a tour guide uniform. Jaslyn began sprinting, screaming for help. The light emitting from the tour guide's flashlight hit Jaslyn in the face and she ran toward it. She could hear all the people chanting and cheering her on. Finally, she made it to them. She collapsed on the ground crying. The guide knelt down to her, not saying a word, just shining his light down the tunnel. He nudged Jaslyn to look, and what she saw just at that edge of the light was the most horrifying thing she could ever possibly imagine. These weren't spirits. These were the condemned, black in form, eyeless, as if they were pacing to entice her to come back. Jaslyn grabbed onto the tour guide as another man helped her to her feet. A man with soft, tender hands. Jaslyn, what happened? It was Thomas. She jerked away from him and screamed. The tour guide in the front motioned for the one in the back. Quickly and swiftly, he got Jaslyn out of the building. Following them out the door and into the parking lot was Thomas, Edith, Robert, and Susie. They helped her across the lot, and she propped herself up against her car, dirty, sweating, crying, and even bleeding from scratches to her legs and arms. No one said a word for a few minutes. Jaslyn pointed at Thomas. You did this to me. Thomas looked around. Me? Jaslyn, I was with the group the entire time. We all were. Why were you in the tunnel? Jaslyn went after him with a raised fist, but was held back quickly by Robert. You all drugged me into that tunnel to play your sick game. If she didn't believe the words they were speaking, surely she had to believe their faces. Jaslyn, we decided not to play the game. We could tell you really weren't into it, so we didn't bring it up again. We didn't go into the tunnel. Jaslyn collapsed to her knees and began crying again. What happened to me? Susie answered. We don't know. There was some kind of noise, and when we turned around, you were gone. We didn't notice right away, but when we did, we made the guides turn around and go looking for you. It took a few minutes, but we saw you slowly walking up the tunnel with some crazy mist pacing behind you, Robert continued, as he sounded more concerned than he had since they met. Jaslyn interrupted. A few minutes? I was in there 2.5 hours. Edith replied, No, more like 5 minutes. Jaslyn told them everything that had happened, the stories, how they were all there, then they weren't. All of it. It was unbelievable. They thought maybe she fell and hit her head, but there was no sign of that, just the scratch marks on her arms and legs. Jaslyn went to Waverly Hills Sanitorium looking for a unique paranormal experience, one that would help her realize her future as a ghost hunter. What she found was something so terrifying that she destroyed any notion she had ever had of going into this line of work or hobby. Jaslyn never ventured away from the world of the living ever again, but she stayed close with Thomas and the rest as just a formality. If you've enjoyed this story or any of my other self-written narrated stories, go on and hit the subscribe button, like the video, leave a comment down below of what you thought, and if you have a story you'd like me to tell, leave that down there as well. Thank you all for watching, I really do appreciate it, and until the next video, stay weird.